On the 17th of October, 1940, an Air Chief Marshal walked into a meeting at the Air Ministry in London. He had just won the most important air battle in history. He had saved his country from Nazi invasion. He walked into that room expecting to brief his superiors on how he did it. Instead, he walked into an ambush. The men across from him had already decided his fate. The man who saved Britain was about to be fired. By November, he was gone. His name was Hugh Dowding. If you had asked anyone in the British military establishment about Hugh Dowding in the early 1930s, they would have told you he was competent, difficult, and not particularly exciting. They had no idea what was coming. Dowding was born in 1882 in Moffat, a small town in Scotland. His father was a schoolmaster. There was nothing glamorous about his upbringing, nothing that screamed future war hero. He went to Winchester College, then to the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, and was commissioned as a subaltern in the Royal Garrison Artillery. For the next several years, he bounced around the British Empire, Gibraltar, Ceylon, Hong Kong, India. He served with a mountain artillery battery and lived the ordinary, forgettable life of a junior officer in peacetime. Then, something changed. Dowding came back to Britain, and he became fascinated with flying machines. This was the early 1910s, when aviation was still a novelty, when the idea of military aircraft was barely a concept. Dowding went to the Aero Club at Brooklands and asked them to teach him to fly. He had no money for lessons, so he asked them to do it on credit. They agreed. A mechanic served as his instructor. After just 2 hours of flight time, Dowding earned his flying certificate. 2 hours. That detail says something about the man. He did not wait for permission. He did not wait for funding. He figured it out. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Dowding joined the Royal Flying Corps. He served as a fighter pilot, then as commanding officer of No. 16 Squadron. He was competent in the air, but what set him apart was his mind for systems and organization. He was already thinking about how aircraft could be used strategically, not just as scouts or individual fighters, but as part of a coordinated defense. And this is where the trouble started. Dowding had a personality that rubbed people the wrong way. He was reserved, blunt, socially awkward. His men gave him the nickname Stuffy, partly because of his alleged lack of humor, partly because he had a way of making conversations feel like interrogations. He clashed with Hugh Trenchard, who would become known as the father of the Royal Air Force. Trenchard was a believer in offensive air power, in bombing campaigns, in taking the fight to the enemy. Dowding was more cautious, more analytical. Their disagreement was not just personal, it was philosophical, and it would define the next 3 decades of British air strategy. Trenchard sent Dowding back to Britain during the war. He was promoted, but he was sidelined. He missed the rest of the fighting in France. For an ambitious officer, this could have been a career killer. But Dowding was not really an ambitious officer in the traditional sense. He was not a politician. He was not a networker. He was a man who believed in doing his job well and assumed that competence would be its own reward, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. After the war, Dowding joined the newly created Royal Air Force in 1918 and spent the next decade in various staff and command positions. He served in the Middle East, came back to Britain, and slowly worked his way up. In 1929, he was promoted to Air Vice Marshal. The following year, he was appointed to the Air Council as Air Member for Supply and Research. This is a title that sounds bureaucratic and boring, but it turned out to be one of the most consequential appointments in military history, because in that role, Dowding did 2 things that would save Britain. First, he championed the development of advanced fighter aircraft. While the rest of the RAF leadership was obsessed with bombers, convinced that the next war would be won through strategic bombing campaigns, Dowding pushed for fast, modern, single-seat fighters. The Supermarine Spitfire, the Hawker Hurricane. Both of these aircraft existed because Dowding believed in them, fought for their funding, and protected their development programs from budget cuts. Without either of those planes, the Battle of Britain could not have been fought, let alone won. Second, and this was arguably even more important, Dowding funded the research into radar. In the mid-1930s, a scientist named Robert Watson Watt demonstrated that radio waves could detect aircraft at a distance. The technology was crude, the results were inconsistent, and most of the military establishment had no idea what to do with it. But Dowding saw the potential immediately. He understood that if you could detect enemy aircraft before they reached the coast, you could get your own fighters into the air in time to intercept them. You would not need to keep planes flying constant patrols, burning fuel and exhausting pilots. You could wait, watch, and respond. Dowding threw his weight behind radar development at a time when almost no one else in the British military cared about it. He secured funding. He pushed for tests. He attended demonstrations. And when a test in 1937 at Bawdsey went badly, with ground controllers scrambling and giving contradictory orders while bombers flew overhead unchallenged, Dowding did not blame the technology. He identified the real problem. The issue was not that radar did not work. The issue was that no one had figured out how to communicate the information it provided to the pilots who needed it. That realization led to the creation of what would become known as the Dowding system. And this is where the story shifts from interesting to extraordinary. In July of 1936, Dowding was appointed the first commander of the newly created RAF Fighter Command. His headquarters was at Bentley Priory, a country house northwest of London that sat above a bomb-proof underground operations room. From that bunker, Dowding spent the next 4 years building the most sophisticated air defense network the world had ever seen. The Dowding system had 4 interlocking parts. First, a chain of radar stations along the south and east coasts of Britain called chain home stations that could detect aircraft forming up over France and give roughly 20 minutes of warning. Second, a network of ground observers from the Royal Observer Corps who could track aircraft once they crossed the coast and flew inland, beyond the radar's reach. Third, a series of operations rooms at Fighter Command headquarters and at each regional group headquarters where all of this information was collected, filtered, and plotted on a giant map table. And fourth, a radio communication system that allowed controllers to direct fighter squadrons to the right place at the right altitude at the right time. I mean, think about that for a second. In the 1930s, before computers, before satellites, before anything resembling modern information technology, Dowding built a real-time data fusion network. Thousands of miles of dedicated telephone lines, connected radar stations to filter rooms to operations, rooms to airfields. Women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force moved wooden blocks across map tables to track incoming raids. Controllers sitting in balconies above those maps made split-second decisions about which squadrons to scramble and where to send them. The whole thing ran on human beings, telephone wires, and a brilliant organizational structure that turned raw data into actionable intelligence faster than anyone thought possible. By the summer of 1940, Britain had around 50 radar stations covering most of the eastern and southern coasts. The Dowding system was operational. It was tested. It was ready. And it was about to be needed in ways that no one could have fully imagined. You have to understand the context here. Before the war, the leadership of the Royal Air Force was utterly committed to the idea that the next war would be won through strategic bombing. It was practically religious doctrine among the senior air marshals that bombers would always get through, that fighter aircraft could never stop a determined bombing offensive. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister in the early 30s, had said it plainly in Parliament: the bomber would always get through. There was no defense. The prevailing wisdom was that the only answer to bombing was more bombing. Build enough bombers and the enemy would not dare attack you. Dowding disagreed with all of this. And, disagreeing with the bomber orthodoxy in the 1930s, RAF was like disagreeing with gravity. It simply was not done. But Dowding had built a system that proved the orthodoxy wrong. His fighters, guided by radar and ground control, could intercept bombers before they reached their targets. The whole strategic assumption that had guided British air planning for a decade was about to be tested. And Dowding was the only senior officer who had bet his career on the alternative. In May of 1940, Germany invaded France and the Low Countries. The French army collapsed faster than anyone had predicted. The British Expeditionary Force was pushed back to the beaches of Dunkirk. And Winston Churchill, who had just become Prime Minister, started demanding that more and more fighter squadrons be sent to France to support the crumbling Allied defense. This put Dowding in an impossible position. Every squadron he sent to France was a squadron that would not be available to defend Britain. And Dowding knew, with a clarity that bordered on prophecy, that France was going to fall. He could see it in the numbers. The loss rates were unsustainable. Sending more fighters across the Channel was not going to save France. It was just going to destroy Fighter Command. On May 15, 1940, Dowding attended a meeting with Churchill, the Air Minister Archibald Sinclair, and Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production. He laid out the numbers. Fighter Command had started with 52 squadrons. It was now down to 36. At the current rate of losses in France, he would have nothing left in 2 weeks. Nothing. The meeting ended with the cabinet voting to send 4 more squadrons to France anyway. The next day, Churchill was in Paris meeting with the French Premier Paul Reynaud, who was begging for more air support. Churchill telephoned London and asked for 6 more fighter squadrons. That same day, May 16, 1940, Dowding wrote the letter that would change the course of the war. It was addressed to the Under-Secretary of State at the Air Ministry, and it was blunt. Dowding wrote that a minimum strength of home defense fighters needed to be established, and that until that minimum was reached, not a single further fighter should be sent across the Channel. He warned that if the home defense force was drained away in desperate attempts to fix the situation in France, defeat in France would involve the final, complete, and irremediable defeat of this country. Those words, final, complete, and irremediable. No one else in the British military establishment was saying this out loud. No one was willing to look at the map and say, France is lost, and if we keep pouring fighters into that loss, we lose everything. Dowding said it. In writing, to the people who did not want to hear it, and it worked. Sinclair brought Dowding's arguments to the cabinet. Churchill was furious, because Dowding's logic had swayed the decision away from what Churchill wanted. But the cabinet agreed to limit further deployments. The 6 additional squadrons could fly from French airfields during the day, but had to return to British bases at night. 3 days later, Churchill cancelled the order entirely, and nearly all Hurricane squadrons were pulled back to operate from home airfields. Dowding had saved Fighter Command, but Churchill never forgave him for it. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. It was the decision that made the Battle of Britain possible. When the evacuation at Dunkirk began at the end of May, Dowding worked closely with Keith Park, the commander of 11 Group, to provide fighter cover for the beaches. It was a brutal job. Dowding had around 200 aircraft available, and they had to fly across the Channel, fight over Dunkirk, and then fly back. The soldiers on the beaches often could not see the RAF fighting overhead and cursed the Air Force for abandoning them. But Dowding's pilots were up there, taking losses every day to keep the Luftwaffe from turning the evacuation into a massacre. Over 9 days, Fighter Command flew more than 2,700 sorties over Dunkirk. They could not prevent all the bombing, but they prevented far worse. By the time the last boats left Dunkirk, over 300,000 Allied troops had been evacuated. It was called a miracle. But for Dowding, it was an agonizing preview of what was coming. He had lost pilots and aircraft he could not afford to lose, defending an evacuation that should never have been necessary. And now, he had to prepare for the real fight. Now, the Battle of Britain itself. July through October of 1940. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at southern England. Wave after wave of bombers, escorted by fighters, came roaring across the English Channel. Their goal was simple: destroy the Royal Air Force, win command of the sky, open the door for Operation Sea Lion, the German invasion of Britain. Dowding had roughly 3,000 pilots under his command. About 80% were British, with the rest drawn from Commonwealth nations and émigré squadrons from Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, and Belgium. His own son, Derek, was among them, flying with 74 Squadron. When Dowding referred to his pilots as his chicks, he was not being cute, he was being literal. These were young men, many of them barely out of training, and he felt a personal responsibility for every single one of them. His strategy was exactly what you would expect from the man who built the Dowding system. It was cautious, calculated, and ruthlessly efficient. He did not try to meet the Luftwaffe in massive set-piece battles. He did not send every available fighter to intercept every incoming raid. Instead, he used his system. Radar detected the raids as they formed over France. Controllers tracked them across the channel. Squadrons were scrambled to intercept at the optimal moment, when the German fighters were running low on fuel and could not stay to protect their bombers. In early August, Dowding learned through ultra-intelligence that the Luftwaffe was preparing for what they called Adlertag, Eagle Day, set for August 13th. It was supposed to be the knockout blow, a series of coordinated attacks designed to destroy fighter command on the ground and in the air. The Germans threw over 1,000 sorties at southern England that day. They hit airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. But the Dowding system held. Controllers rerouted squadrons. Damaged radar stations came back online within hours. Fighters scrambled from secondary airfields when their primary bases were cratered. The Germans could not understand it. They kept bombing, day after day through late August and early September, targeting fighter command's airfields in southeastern England. Sector stations at Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch, and Manston were hit repeatedly. Some were badly damaged. Pilots were flying 4 or 5 sorties a day, landing with barely enough fuel, grabbing a sandwich, and going back up. The attrition was grinding, and when his pilots were exhausted, Dowding rotated them. He pulled battered squadrons out of the front line in southeastern England and replaced them with fresher units from quieter sectors. The German commanders, Albert Kesselring and Hugo Sperl, did not do this. Their pilots flew until they dropped. By September of 1940, the strain was becoming unbearable. Dowding's fighter reserves were critically low. On September 1st, he realized there were no more fresh squadrons to rotate into 11 Group, the sector that covered southeastern England and took the heaviest fighting. He took what he called a desperate expedient and reorganized his forces into 3 categories. A-type squadrons stayed on the front line. B-type squadrons in the flanking groups would relieve them. C-type squadrons became training units, feeding new pilots into the system as fast as possible. Then, the Germans made their biggest mistake. On September 7th, the Luftwaffe switched its attacks from Fighter Command's airfields to London. The Blitz had begun. It was devastating for civilians, but it was a gift to Dowding. His battered airfields got time to repair. His exhausted pilots got a chance to breathe. The pressure on Fighter Command's infrastructure, which had been reaching a breaking point, suddenly eased. Then came September 15th, 1940. The Luftwaffe launched massive raids against London, wave after wave. Fighter Command met them with everything it had. The RAF shot down around 56 German aircraft that day, though the actual number was later revised. More importantly, the sheer ferocity of the defense convinced the Luftwaffe commanders that Fighter Command had deeper reserves than it actually did. The Germans believed they were fighting an air force that could not be broken. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion of Britain was off. Dowding had won. His system worked, his strategy worked, his careful management of pilots and aircraft, his refusal to be drawn into reckless engagements, his insistence on fighting the battle on his own terms, all of it had been vindicated. Fighter Command had not achieved total air superiority. The Luftwaffe continued to bomb Britain long after September, but the fact that Fighter Command had prevented the Germans from gaining control of the sky was enough. In strategic terms, it was a British victory, the most important British victory of the war. So what happened to the man who made it possible? He was fired. Up to this point, Dowding had been winning. That was about to flip. The seeds of his downfall had been planted months earlier, and they grew from a tactical disagreement that had far more to do with politics and ego than with military strategy. It was called the Big Wing Controversy. Here is the background. Fighter Command was divided into regional groups. 11 Group, commanded by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, covered London and the southeast. It bore the brunt of the German attacks. 12 Group, commanded by Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, covered the area north of the Thames. Dowding and Park worked closely together. They shared the same philosophy: send small, fast formations to intercept raids. Get in, break up the bombers, get out. Use the system. Leigh-Mallory disagreed. He wanted to send up massive formations, big wings of 3 to 5 squadrons, to overwhelm the German bombers in a single devastating blow. The idea had romantic appeal. It sounded aggressive and decisive. And it was championed by one of the most famous pilots in the RAF, Squadron Leader Douglas Bader, a legless fighter ace with an enormous personality and a direct line to Leigh-Mallory. The problem was that big wings took too long to assemble. By the time you got 30 or 60 fighters into formation, the German bombers had already dropped their payload and turned for home. Worse, while 12 Group was busy forming up its big wing, it was supposed to be protecting 11 Group's airfields. Park's bases were getting bombed because Leigh-Mallory was not providing the cover he was supposed to. And if that were the only problem, Dowding might have survived it. But then Sholto Douglas got involved. Air Vice Marshal Sholto Douglas was the Deputy Chief of Air Staff. He sat in the Air Ministry, not in a fighter cockpit, and he had been working against Dowding for years. Douglas agreed with the big wing theory. More importantly, he saw an opportunity. A staff officer later noted that during the Battle of Britain, there was plenty of telephone conversation between Leigh-Mallory and Sholto Douglas. Even though Leigh-Mallory barely spoke to his own commander-in-chief, Douglas was building a coalition. Leigh-Mallory provided the grievance. Bader provided the credibility of a combat pilot. Douglas provided the political muscle inside the Air Ministry. On October 17, 1940, a meeting was arranged at the Air Ministry. Officially, it was to discuss fighter tactics and night defense. The Chief of Air Staff, Cyril Newall, was supposed to chair it, but he fell ill at the last minute. The chair was taken by Sholto Douglas. Dowding walked in expecting to give a summary of his strategy in the battle he had just won. Instead, he found Douglas Bader sitting there among the air marshals. Leigh-Mallory had brought him so the ministry could hear the views of a fighting pilot, but Douglas did not invite any of the squadron leaders who disagreed with the big wing concept. Park's pilots, the ones who had actually borne the heaviest fighting, were not represented. The meeting became an ambush. Dowding was cross-examined about his tactics. Bader argued for big wings. Leigh-Mallory backed him up. Sholto Douglas, who was supposed to be a neutral chair, acted more like a prosecutor. When the discussion turned to night defense and Dowding pushed back against some of the Air Ministry's proposals, it was used as further evidence that he was inflexible and difficult. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did. In November of 1940, Dowding was removed from command. He was replaced by Sholto Douglas. Keith Park was also removed from 11 Group and replaced by Leigh-Mallory. The two men who had actually won the Battle of Britain were gone. The men who had spent the battle arguing about tactics from behind desks took their places. Dowding was not given a retirement with honors. He was not thanked publicly by the government. Instead, he was sent on a mission to the United States to study aircraft production. He was unsuitable for the role, and everyone knew it. It was a face-saving assignment designed to push him quietly out the door. He came back to Britain and was given a review of RAF economy and organization, basically a desk job. He finally retired from the Royal Air Force in July of 1942. And what about the men who replaced him? Sholto Douglas took over fighter command and immediately launched offensive sweeps across the English Channel. These operations, known as rhubarbs and circuses, sent fighters over occupied France to provoke the Luftwaffe into battle. They achieved very little strategically and cost fighter command more pilots than the Battle of Britain had. The aggressive tactics that Douglas had demanded from behind his desk turned out to be exactly the kind of wasteful, reckless strategy that Dowding had spent his career preventing. In 1943, Dowding was made a baron. He became Baron Dowding of Bentley Priory, a nod to the headquarters where he had directed the battle. but he was deliberately denied promotion to Marshal of the Royal Air Force, the highest rank in the service. The stated reason was that only former Chiefs of Air Staff had been given that rank. But that precedent was conveniently ignored at the end of the war, when both Sholto Douglas and Bomber Harris were promoted to Marshal of the Royal Air Force. Neither of them had ever served as Chief of Air Staff. Churchill, the man whose government Dowding had saved, barely mentioned him in the second volume of his war memoirs. In the few passages where Dowding appeared, Churchill distorted the record. He wrote that Dowding had declared he could defend Britain with 25 squadrons, when in fact, Dowding had written to Churchill expressing grave concern about defending the country with just 36. It was a deliberate diminishment of the man who had told Churchill truths he did not want to hear. Dowding spent his later years pursuing interests that would have seemed eccentric to his former colleagues. He became involved in spiritualism and theosophy. He claimed to have communicated with the spirits of his dead pilots. He campaigned against animal cruelty and vivisection. The serious, awkward Air Chief Marshal who had built the most advanced air defense system in the world spent his retirement attending seances and writing letters about the rights of animals. And this part of his story, the strange, mystical final act, is what makes him so fascinating. Because the same mind that could identify the data communication problem in a radar test, the same analytical intelligence that built the Dowding system from nothing, that same mind also believed it could talk to ghosts. You can read that as a sign of decline, or you can read it as a man who had carried the weight of 3,000 young lives on his shoulders, who had watched his pilots die every day for months, and who needed to believe that their deaths had meaning beyond the tactical. Dowding would look back on the Battle of Britain and know that he had been right. He had been right about the fighters. He had been right about radar. He had been right about France. He had been right about his strategy, and he had been punished for every single correct decision he made. He died on February 15th, 1970, at his home in Tunbridge Wells. He was 87 years old. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, beneath the Battle of Britain memorial window. His son Derek, who had flown as one of his chicks during the battle, succeeded him as Baron Dowding. In the end, history has done what the RAF refused to do during his lifetime. It has given Hugh Dowding credit. His system, his strategy, his stubborn refusal to sacrifice his fighters in a lost cause on the continent, these are now recognized as the factors that saved Britain in 1940. Without Dowding, there would have been no Spitfire, no Hurricane, no radar chain, no integrated defense system. Without that system, Fighter Command would have been fighting blind. And without Fighter Command, Hitler's invasion fleet would have had clear skies over the English Channel. The man they called Stuffy, the awkward, humorless, difficult general that nobody wanted to have dinner with, turned out to be the only person in the British military establishment who saw clearly what was coming and prepared for it. He built the shield that saved his country, and then his country threw him away. He once wrote a final message to his pilots after being removed from command. In it, he told them he wished he could say all that was in his heart. He said he could not hope to surpass the simple eloquence of Churchill's words about how never before had so much been owed by so many to so few. And then he added, quietly, that the debt remained and would increase. He was right about that too. The debt has never been paid. But at the very least, the story should be told. If this video made you think differently about the Battle of Britain, hit subscribe and drop a comment about what part of Dowding's story surprised you the most. And if you haven't already, smash that like button so more people can find this video.